Man becomes lonely if he knows more than others. This statement by Carl Jung opens a wide horizon for us to understand the real suffering of man in the face of knowledge. These words are not just a reflection on the individual's relationship with society, but rather a clear expression of the suffering of human existence itself, where a person who transcends the boundaries of knowledge is struck by a wall of loneliness that does not escape him. Jung, who used to see in collective unconsciousness the strength of human accumulation in their cultural and psychological heritages, here expresses the tension between individual understanding and collective loneliness, when a person who transcends the boundaries of knowledge is struck by a wall of loneliness that does not escape him. He will have no choice but to walk the path of deep understanding, which others cannot overcome. What Jung puts forth in this statement is what we might call the threshold of understanding. The deeper the individual is in knowledge, the wider the gap between him and others. This gap is not limited to the boundaries of the mind alone, but extends to include social and cultural values that determine how individuals interact with each other. When a person carries inside him some facts that others cannot imagine, these facts begin to create an invisible barrier between him and the world around him. It is as if this person discovers a world that is hidden, while those around him remain stuck in the apparent world. At this moment, the person who is alone in his knowledge turns into a stranger in his homeland, where his effort pushes him to achieve the truth to the threshold of loneliness. In this threshold, a deep inner conflict takes shape. A deep inner conflict is a conflict between a person's effort to understand, and his basic need for social belonging. Knowledge, in its essence, is nothing but a long road to the realization of the truth. But this road may be full of thorns that isolate the individual from others. Jung says that when a person has advanced awareness, he finds himself in a confrontation with the shadow, that dark side of himself that includes the sides of the psychological life. Deep knowledge often means confronting the harsh facts that lead to his inner isolation. Just as the hero confronts his own challenges in existential literature in the face of the harsh reality of his existence. On the existential level, Jung's saying is the opposite. A person becomes alone if he knows more than others. The individual's crisis in societies that do not accept difference, or, on the contrary, are unable to comprehend the real complexities that go beyond the familiar. A person who has a deeper awareness of what surrounds him, and knows the facts that the collective mind cannot comprehend, finds himself in a confrontation between the needs of the community and his desire to break away from its constraints. The dilemma is that this knowledge does not open up a horizon of mutual understanding, but rather puts him in a temporary isolation, where he becomes rejected or misunderstood by those who cannot comprehend what is beyond the apparent. He is in a situation where he tries to understand the deep truth and challenges the standards of society that impose on him a narrow vision of the world. This existential isolation is embodied by the internal separation between the individual who has a deep understanding and the innate need for social belonging. The more the individual's ability to comprehend increases, the more he distances himself from his community, because the deeper understanding cannot agree with the traditions or concepts of the familiar society, which are often based on inherited ignorance or accurate ignorance. This individual remains in a constant internal conflict between his awareness of his unique existence and his desire to harmonize with others. And instead of his knowledge being a bridge to communication, it becomes a barrier that separates him from everyone else. This tension between individuality and isolation is evident in works such as Dostoevsky's The Devils, where the author reflects the suffering of the heroes who cross the moral and social boundaries. In the novel, you will find the characters trying to overcome the traditional concepts of good and evil in a bitter internal battle. When they cross these boundaries, they discover that they have separated themselves from the social reality that cannot bear their extremist ideas. This existential separation is evident in the character of Patras, who strives to rebel against the established values, so that he finds himself, in the end, isolated from everyone, but sometimes in a conflict with himself. This separation is not just a conflict with society, but with the values that he believed represented their shared reality. This situation that these heroes are suffering from is not an individual case, but a reflection of the human condition that every thinker, creator, or pervert lives in, crossing the familiar boundaries. The creator who strives to present a new understanding of life, or the researcher who opens doors that society has not yet dared to open, finds himself in a place similar to a temporary isolation. This isolation is more bitter than the social unity, because it becomes a reflection of a deeper conflict between the self-reality and the collective reality, between the self that rejects the mind, and between the society that insists on staying in a state of cognitive and existential stability. This isolation that the individual faces is not just a social isolation, but a spiritual and mental separation from the environment. In this context, the individual becomes in a state of constant contradiction between his attempts to reach the truth and the difficulty of communicating with those who are trapped in cognitive darkness. As the knowledge increases, the distance between him and others increases, until he finally discovers that knowledge is not just a tool for communication, but sometimes it is another source of isolation that he cannot bear. This existential tension between individuality, knowledge, and isolation also allows us to see the deep gap between man and his human brother, which can be seen in existential literature and philosophical works that deal with the self and existence. A deep understanding of this context does not only give the individual the ability to analyze and examine, but also to drown him in a sea of existential isolation that may be more severe than any social unity. From a psychological point of view, Jung's statement stands out as a deep connection between cognitive awareness and psychological isolation. This is what we can link to Jung's understanding of the shadow in the human soul. The shadow is that part of the self that remains hidden in the unconscious, and includes feelings, thoughts, and motivations that we refuse to acknowledge or that we keep inside us. In the case of a person who knows more than others, this process of consciousness brings with it his confrontation with this inner shadow. When self-awareness and deep thinking increase, a person faces dark sides of himself that were previously hidden under the surface of consciousness. These are the sides that society or the surrounding culture cannot accept. This confrontation with the shadow can be painful, because the individual may find himself in a state of alienation from himself and those around him. Consciousness, in this context, becomes a weapon with limits. On the one hand, it is a means to free oneself from ignorance, and allows the person to understand himself and the world around him in a greater depth. But, on the other hand, this consciousness also becomes a way to reveal the sides that were hidden in the soul, which may lead to a deep inner conflict. This inner conflict between consciousness and shadow coincides with the philosophical concept proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche in his book So Spoke Zoroastrianism, where he talks about the superhuman, or Übermensch, who transcends the social and moral values of tradition to fully realize himself. But Nietzsche explains that this cognitive and intellectual superiority comes at a cost, the isolation of the individual from society. Although knowledge gives strength and ability to influence, it may also lead to the isolation of the individual. This understanding of existence, full of conflict between the individual and society, is what makes the superior individual isolated in the eyes of others. As for the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, existence itself is seen as a state of confusion. Heidegger in his work, The Existence and Time, indicates that man, with his awareness of his death and the limitation that distinguishes his existence, becomes in a state of existential isolation. When a person begins to realize the deep truth about his existence, including the underlying understanding of time and place, he faces a spiritual isolation that represents existential anxiety. This deep awareness, which reveals the fragility of existence, pushes man to face the inner shadow, which was unknown to him in the beginning, which strengthens the isolation even more. From another psychological point of view, we find that Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychological analysis, talked about the existence of these fixed aspects in the human soul, which constitute the greater part of the unconscious. When a person becomes more aware of himself, these fixed aspects begin to appear, which strengthens the feeling of isolation. Freud believes that the increased awareness presents man with an inner conflict between what is fixed in the unconscious and what is imposed by society based on rules and values.